Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today, sponsored by the Access Forum. My name is Anastasia Papas, and I'm the founder of the forum. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Zacharias Sautner, who will present his paper, Do Investors Care About Biodiversity? Zacharias is a professor of sustainable finance at the University of Zurich. He's senior chair at the Swiss Finance Institute and director of the European Finance Association. He has written and published some important work on ESG, and I think now he's tackling biodiversity, which is a subject that is gaining importance, especially after the recent publication of reports that highlight the significant biodiversity loss over the last 50 years, while at the same time the UN warns that more than 50% of the global GDP depends on nature and the services it provides. So this promises to be a very interesting presentation. But before I pass the floor to Zacharias, I would like to invite you to take our short survey. So there are two questions. So one is, what is the largest source of a typical company's negative impact on biodiversity? And the second question is, do investors price the impact of companies on biodiversity? Okay. So 55% think that the largest source of typical companies' negative impact on biodiversity is through land use, and then water pollution. And for the second question, do investors price the impact of companies on biodiversity? 82% voted no. Okay. So, Zacharias, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, for the introduction and for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about my work. I think when Anastasia was speaking at some point, I didn't hear you, Anastasia, entirely clearly. In case this is my connection and you have problems hearing me too, just let me know so we can look for a solution. So this is a somewhat unusual presentation because if you're an academic, you know that usually, we present papers that are not yet accepted or forthcoming in a journal. And so this is different because the paper, Do Investors Care About Biodiversity, that I'll present here, has already been accepted recently for publication in the Review of Finance. And I think that's important because we, but also the journal, were quite fast and efficient in the review process. But I think it's also a manifestation of the fact that the topic has gained so much importance over the last months, actually, that I think it's still, or we think it's still a very good idea to present this paper. But it means for you that, if you share comments, I can't incorporate them anymore in the manuscript. But of course, I keep working on the topic. And so, if you have broader thoughts on, issues to investigate and consider, and, if you also have, thoughts about that not making sense, what we've done here, please share it. I'd be grateful. This is joint work. So I'm here at the University of Zurich, UZH, and at SFI, as Anastasia said, and it's joint work with Alexandre Garel, Arthur Petit-Romanec, and Alexander Wagner. And Alexander is also here in Zurich, and the other two gentlemen there in France. And so as I said, the paper is forthcoming in the Review of Finance, so you'll see it soon in print if you want to see, the final product. And I say that because I'll jump over lots of details in the presentation, given that it's only 40 minutes. You see in the background basically where I'm sitting at the moment. So if I, put my finger here, if you go along the lake, I'm sitting somewhere here. The university is this building here. It's our main building. If you enter the building, you'll see the PhD certificate of Albert Einstein. He did a PhD at University of Zurich, and I'm currently, basically in my home office, which is along the lake here. I'm lucky to enjoy this beautiful vista that you also see here. So now let's get into the topic. Now, I don't know how old you are, but definitely when I think back of my early years, when I was a kid, I remember this picture that you see here a lot. So I remember a lot when, being in the car with my parents and we would drive, especially on a highway, that, after, parking the car, the windshield would, basically look like what you see here on this picture. It was full of, dead insects, mosquitoes, flies, and, other insects, small insects. And, this was just common. It was very common. If you now drive on the highway, if I drive on the highway with now my kids in the back, the windshield doesn't look like this anymore at all. And this is a manifestation of biodiversity loss, of the fact that here concretely, the amount of mosquitoes, flies, bugs in the air has decreased significantly since, my early childhood relative to today. Now, I learned from my colleague who's frequently in northern Sweden that if you drive to Sweden, you may still have a windshield like this, right? So it's not entirely gone, this so-called windshield phenomenon, but certainly in large parts of the world it is. And so this is basically an example of a much broader phenomenon, namely that biodiversity, which we define as the variety of living organisms in all habitats, has massively in an unprecedented speed declined over the last years. To put some numbers around this, and you see this visualized here also in the WWF and Zoological Society of London chart. So between 1970 and 2018, the world has seen a 70% loss of monitored wildlife. That's just one dimension, of course, of biodiversity loss. And now you may say, okay, well, pretty bad. We feel sorry for all these, animals and, species that, basically disappeared. But actually, we are also affected by it, significantly affected by it. And Anastasia was already mentioning some numbers. So there are estimates that 50% of world GDP depend in some form of biodiversity, of ecosystem services, which is basically what is provided to us humans by species and habitats. And just to give you another illustration of the economic dimensions of all of this, this is a picture from China where you see a Chinese apple farmer who, because of the significant reductions of bees in that specific area, has to pollinate by hand the flowers, the apple trees. Now, you may say, okay, who cares about apple farmers in China? But as the 50% dependence of our GDP suggests, it's much broader. Maybe you like snorkeling and you like going to Hurghada in Egypt or to the Great Barrier Reef. Now, if also in our oceans, the wildlife disappears, you may not longer go to Egypt or Australia to do snorkeling. And as you can imagine, that has important implications for these and other countries' tourism, activities, an example for ecosystem services provided by nature. It extends actually also to things that you may be affected from, because a lot of pharmaceutical products also depend strongly on nature and biodiversity. So it's a really, really important and big theme. And the theme has received huge attention recently. And what we are seeing now is, on all kinds of dimensions, regulatory efforts to address it. And before I dive into the details of the regulatory movements that we are seeing, let me make one important classification at the beginning. When we think about biodiversity and biodiversity risk, we think of basically two types of risk. The first type is biodiversity transition risk. The second type is biodiversity physical risk. We call the first also, the transition risk, also impact risk. So the risk that arises because companies impact negatively biodiversity. And the second, dependency risk, because it captures dependency of firms on nature. So in the first example, or in the first type of risk, what I mean is that there's a risk for companies that negatively impact biodiversity, reduce biodiversity, because these firms at some point may be affected by regulation that aims at combating biodiversity loss, at protecting nature. They themselves may not be dependent on nature for their production and ecosystem services. Think of a company that produces lots of plastics, and the plastic product ends up somewhere in the ocean and destroys the ecosystem services that you're using for diving activities. To the contrary, on the dependency side, right, it is about firms that rely on nature and biodiversity for producing services, ecosystem services themselves. Think of the apple farmers farming services more generally. In this paper, I'm focusing on the first type of risk, transition risk, and whether how this specific risk is measured, and eventually also whether and how this risk is priced in financial markets. There's much less on the dependency side, and one of the reasons is because we have much more of a difficulty of measuring such dependency. There are fewer measures available, credible measures available to be used. But this is going to change. As you can see, this kind of divide into two types of risk is very similar to what we've seen on the climate risk side, where we've also divided basically climate risks in transition risks, basically stemming from carbon emissions that firms generate, and physical risks stemming from physical parameter changes in the climate, like storms and sea level rise and so on. So it's very similar. Now let's come to the current evolvements in biodiversity regulation. So what we've seen recently, and really just recently, because of course biodiversity loss has been a topic that many scholars in biology, geography have been writing on for many, many years. Yeah, it's recent because in earlier years, all kinds of efforts to protect it globally have basically failed. But this has changed. So recently, we have had some important first steps to protect biodiversity and biological diversity. And in particular, what we have had is a sort of Paris Agreement equivalent on the biodiversity side, with the Kunming Declaration in 2021 and the Montreal Agreement in 2022. Together also coined the COP15. So similar to the COPs on the climate side, they're also conferences of the parties, COPs on the biodiversity side. And so what these globally agreed summits have basically done is they have defined all kinds of ambitions to protect biodiversity, reduce biodiversity loss, and in particular also indicate that regulatory efforts need to be undertaken by different countries to achieve this. As a side note, I know lots of you work in finance. Also here, similar to Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, there is a clause that says that we have to readjust finance flows in order to protect biodiversity. So also there, the biodiversity side, there's a clear imperative for the financial sector to help achieve this fight, successful, hopefully, fight against biodiversity loss. Now, this is just one evolution. Also on, the more specific company side, what we've seen is something similar to the climate side, namely the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, modeled after the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It was launched just in June 2021, with a final framework having been released in September 2023. And it is initially voluntary, kind of making recommendations how firms should report on nature risks, so including biodiversity dependency and biodiversity transition risks. But if you talk to the people involved in the task force, you hear immediately that they say that it's just a question of time until when these voluntary disclosure regulations will actually become mandatory, as we have seen it also on the climate side, where, as you may know, for example, the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, has been moving forward with mandatory climate-related disclosure guidelines. And the ISSB is actually, in the thought process of doing something similar on the nature, on the biodiversity side. I know a little bit because my co-author Alex just presented last week at a big summit in Frankfurt, organized or co-organized by the ISSB. So these nature topics are on the radar and at a top priority. But it extends, from governments to disclosure standards, also to central banks and financial market regulators. All of them are also paying significant attention. And for example, there was an NGFS report in 2022 highlighting the importance of biodiversity risk. And just to put this into kind of perspectives, Frank Elderson, he's on the board of the ECB, European Central Bank. He has made a statement where he argued that biodiversity loss actually constitutes a systemic risk, similar to climate risk. So also there, it's just a question of time until when the regulators will require biodiversity stress tests, maybe also make kind of other attempts to kind of get more transparency about the pricing of the risk, and focusing also on all kinds of regulatory efforts to provide disclosures on these. Now, despite the fact that we've seen discussions on the regulatory side, discussions by central bankers, despite the fact that we all agree this is such a significant topic also for finance, there is hardly any research by finance scholars on the topic, in particular by academic finance scholars on the topic. So some people argue that, and especially also Andrew Caroli, who has been writing some important work kind of igniting not just the climate finance, but also the biodiversity finance literature. Right? Some people argue that, basically we are in a situation like what we've had about 5 years plus in the climate finance literature. We're also there, despite the topic having become so important among practitioners, investors, companies, there has been hardly any academic, serious academic research on the topic. And as you may know, this was then ignited by this call for papers by the Review of Financial Studies, which had the idea of asking authors to submit proposals on climate finance topics that would then be evaluated, and if promising, would get a conditional acceptance or in principle acceptance at the Review of Financial Studies, one of the top 3 journals we have in finance, to eventually get published. And I think, I was lucky to be part of, this initial special issue by the RFS. I think this has really, really helped explode the climate finance literature. And now we have, seen hundreds, not to say thousands of papers on the topic. So we're in a similar situation like in the climate finance literature. And there's good news. And the good news is that the RF, the Review of Finance, has actually just released a similar call for proposals for a special issue on nature, on biodiversity. So if you're interested in it, I think the deadline is in August, I think August 1st. You should go on the RF webpage. And RF is a fantastic outlet. It's applying top 3 standards in terms of refereeing papers, because it wants to be at par with the top 3 journals, and I think they're really getting there, or are there maybe even. So therefore, it's also for us academics a very serious outlet that gets a lot of attention, and I think it's a very smart move from them to help ignite this biodiversity finance topic. Now, we are not the only ones that have started to work on the topic. There are a few other papers as well, and probably as we speak, more papers are being written. So apologies if you have a paper that I'm not citing here. This is kind of reflecting the state of the literature when a couple of months ago we got the final paper accepted. So there's a paper by Flammer, Giroux, and Hill, and they look at biodiversity finance in the sense that they look at how private capital, how funds can be used to address biodiversity loss and nature restoration. There's a paper by Sautner et al., including 2 people also from here in Zurich, that study with a focus on a specific sector, infrastructure funds, the effects of biodiversity management, and show it's associated with lower credit default swap slopes, so also financial implication of it. There's a paper by Stefano Giglio and co-authors, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, that also looks at biodiversity risk, but focusing primarily on a measurement based on 10Ks, disclosures of biodiversity risk in 10Ks, which they then aggregate at the firm level and use as an asset pricing factor, and also see how how that correlates with biodiversity news. So another important paper that you should have a look at, because I think it nicely also complements our approach, and we need more papers with more different approaches, and so therefore this paper is also quite important. Again, I'll talk more about it in a little bit. And then there's a paper by Jin et al., who relate MSCI's biodiversity exposure and management measure to returns and operating performance. But they don't find any relationships of this specific MSCI measure being price. So what we do in this paper is, as I said, we focus on biodiversity impact. Right? We call it the biodiversity footprint. Similar to the carbon footprint, if you think about climate finance and climate transition risk. We have a firm-specific measure, a global sample, and what we do is we also look at a stock returns analysis and combine it with some event studies, and all the details will be clear in a little bit. So you need to understand a little bit the sample and the measure we have, and I think that's probably something where you have, at least where I had the steepest learning curve. Not in all the tests that I'll show you in a little bit, and where I'll be a little bit faster as well. But the biggest learning I had was in terms of thinking about what biodiversity is and how one can measure the biodiversity imprint of companies. And that's really challenging, let me tell you, because having a measure at the firm level that you compare across many companies is really something very tricky and something that we believe, as far as we understood, only our data provider, Iceberg Data Lab, has been producing with a historic sample, but now also other data providers like MSCI and ISS are, providing or trying to provide in the next month in order to have something similar. But to our knowledge, they don't have a time series that goes back. So which is very important for the tests we are doing. So they have point in time data essentially, because we are of course looking at how this biodiversity footprint was priced historically, and so we need historical data. So we have the biodiversity footprint that I'll explain you in a second from this data provider, Iceberg Data Lab, from 2018 to 2021 for about 2,000 firms. And oh yeah, I wanted to say, the challenge is really to have a measure at the firm or firm year level. I say that because when we presented this paper to our biodiversity scholars in the biology department, geography department, when they heard about the measure, they were first kind of saying, not sure that this is a great measure. There are better ones. Yes, there are better ones, but the problem is they're not really better ones that are really aggregatable, that you can aggregate at the firm level. There are better ones if you want to, at the micro level, measure in a certain spatial area how biodiversity is affected by a plant, by construction. If you look at very specific ecosystems. Yeah, but what you need here is basically a measure that you can have available for a large set of firms at an aggregate level. And when we explain this to our esteemed colleagues, at the end, they also usually agree and say, yes, maybe it's not the perfect measure, there are better ones, but maybe it's the best measure we can have to get it roughly right and have a measure at the firm level. And as I just said, right, the measure that I'll show you here is very similar to what data providers are now about to propose, or have just proposed, if you think about the measures by ISS and also MSCI and maybe also others that are currently doing this. Probably the big step forward that I think lots of people are working on at the moment is kind of looking at satellite data, measuring biodiversity impact of companies based on satellite data combined with plant locations and then aggregating this up. So I think this is something that will become available at some point as well. For your information, because we also look at the pricing effects by investors, our data has been used by multiple asset managers, including PNB, or Robeco and Mirova. It's a French data provider, so probably not surprising that it's been used primarily also by French providers. But this has probably broadened in the meantime. Okay, so here's what we do. We take a measure that is called the corporate biodiversity footprint, and it's a measure that aggregates the biodiversity loss caused by firm activities resulting from environmental pressures, such as land use, nitrogen deposition, emissions, and the release of toxic compounds. I'll categorize those different pressures in a moment. The key concept that you need to know, and that's where some of the biology scholars are saying, what you're using MSA, and eventually say, okay, in your context, it makes a lot of sense, is mean species abundance, is MSA. So that's the metric that allows us to measure how a firm impacts biodiversity. So essentially, the measure that we use, the corporate biodiversity footprint, tells us how much MSA, mean species abundance, changes due to the activities of a firm. And mean species abundance is what it says. It's the abundance. It has to be, of course, in a relative to a spatial area, the abundance of species. So what we're trying to measure is how a company's activities reduces the abundance of species, either in a given spatial area. It's also, by the way, a reference metrics used by, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, or the IPBES. Okay, so it's not an esoteric thing. It's something that also lots of policymakers and also investors, by the way, if you look at recent investment documents, are paying attention to. So I need to explain you the concept of MSA. So look at the picture. On the top, we see a situation where MSA is 100%, where you have mean species abundance that is, like in a pristine, perfect environment. And in the bottom, we have an MSA of 0% because of land degradation, intensive agriculture. So an area with an MSA of 0% has completely lost its original biodiversity or is colonized by invasive species, while an MSA of 100% on the top reflects biodiversity level equal to an original undisturbed ecosystem. Right? So what we try to do is we try to measure how a firm's activities reduce MSA. And of course, it has to be relative, to a spatial concept. So basically, and I'll explain the details, what the CBF measure does is it measures the reduction in MSA over a spatial area. So for example, because the numbers, will become clear in a moment, if the MSA score is 100 kilometers square MSA, that's the measure. So kilometer square MSA is like kilowatt hours, that's the measurement. It means that that company in that year with a CBF of 100 kilometer square MSA is reducing mean species abundance by 10% over 1,000 kilometers, or equivalently by 100% over 100 kilometers square, or 1% over 10,000 kilometers square. Okay, so what I'm going to use later in all the tests is a number, a CBF, a score that is, for example, 100 kilometers square MSA, and here you see the interpretation. Okay, it's an estimation, of course, right? I cannot pinpoint that this is the spatial area where MSA was reduced from 100% to 0, right? It's an aggregation and it's an estimation. But of course, you can imagine it varies a lot across companies. So basically, the measure is constructed in 3 steps. Step 1, one takes a company's revenues, separates them into sales and countries. So we have a sales by segment by country database. And then the data provider is kind of decomposing these business activities by segment and country into the inputs and the outputs that are being used. Okay? So one is able, based on a segment description, segment classification, to get a measure of what input is, what kind of input products are being used, and what output is being produced. Right? If, for example, we have, that's an example I'll show you in a moment, if we look at Danone producing yogurt and milk, one looks, for example, the milk segment in the US, and the input is the tons of milk that are used to produce milk and yogurt and other things. Then in the next step, one separates these different inputs and outputs into so-called pressures, into 4 pressures. That these products, right, the milk and of course the cows that are behind it, are generating for the environment. 4 pressures. And that's where the question 1 comes in, by the way, that we've seen in the pre-survey. Pressure 1 is land use, pressure 2 is greenhouse gas emissions, pressure 3 air pollution, pressure 4 water pollution. So if you think about milk, the biggest pressure, of course, is on land use because of all the cows that are producing the milk that is used by Danone or by Nestle and other food companies. Note, these are usually not the cows of the companies that are producing the yogurt. So scope 3, if you're familiar with this term, so the supply chain effects are very important to incorporate in this measure. And then in the 3rd step, what's being done, and I can't go into the details because it's pretty complicated, is that one uses the so-called globial model, which is a relatively well-established model in that literature, in order to translate now the pressures into an impact on biodiversity along these 4 pressures. And you see the same here, basically. All right, so the 3 steps are illustrated here as well. So on the left, there's input. It's the business activities. So one looks at some key metrics like revenues by region and, of course, what the inputs are. then one quantifies these 4 environmental pressures using life cycle analysis, and then uses the pressure impact relationship estimated by this global model to quantify the impact from these 4 pressures on biodiversity. So if you take a company that produces milk, right, the main pressure comes from land use. So then the global model tells us how we translate the milk, the tons of milk, and the impact on land use into a change, into an effect in terms of change of biodiversity. Right? How, for example, a ton of milk reduces biodiversity, measured again in kilometers square MSA. And one does the same for the other measures, aggregates this then up at the firm level and has a number. Even more concretely, take Danone's 2021 numbers. So in our data, they have a CBF of, you see there, it's about 10,000 kilometers square MSA. Right? To give you an illustration of that number, that would be like reducing MSA, mean species abundance, biodiversity, from 100% to 0 over a space that is as big as Lebanon, the country. Right? If we, put it in terms of effect of 100% to 0. Right? Of course, if you do it, reduce it, if you do the 100% reduction, but 10% reduction, the spatial area that we would classify this would be 10 times as large. Right? And what do you see here? Where's the biggest impact coming from for Danone? Well, you see it's coming from land use, right? Almost everything is coming from land use. If you go up just above the CBF number, right? The first line, 10,314, that's the land use component. And that's coming because of, the cows, and you see this here, right? So if you start on the left, right? So they have about, 19 billion revenues in euros. And so then one separates this into the different, products and regions. And so here, for example, we know that they are using in the production 2 million tons of milk, 500,000 tons of milk skimmed from skimmed milk, and also the quantities for yogurt and so on. So we have the kind of tons of milk, 1 million tons of milk. We know what that means in terms of the pressure because of the cows, and we know how that then translates into a change in MSA. So that's basically what the CBF does. But as I said, there are other measures that are also aggregatable. It can be aggregated at the firm year level, such as STAR, PDF, BII, and BIM. And actually, some of them are very similar to the corporate biodiversity footprint, and some of them are also going to be parts of the products that some of the data providers are going to offer soon, right? But they're similar, very similar. If you think of PDF, for example, and our measure. Okay, let me get to the data and results. The mean footprint is 123 kilometers square .MSA. But as I said, there's large variation, right? Take the numbers from Danone, that were 14,000 or something like this. So what firms have the largest CBF? Well, it's retail and wholesale firms, paper and forest firms, and food firms. That makes a lot of sense, right? Retail and wholesale because of the supply chain, paper and forest because they're cutting, trees and thereby reduce biodiversity. Now, here's the answer to the first question. Where is the, footprint coming from primarily? Well, it's coming primarily from land use, followed by greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, air pollution. And scope 3 is very important, and you see this here. So if you decompose the overall CBF in the sample, right? So 50% comes from land use, 20% water pollution, 22% greenhouse gas emissions, 10% air pollution, and 80% of the CBF comes from scope 3 components, right? The farmers supplying milk to the milk and yogurt producer and cheese producer. So I talked about Chilio et al.'s paper, and here's something that is kind of important to understand if you compare our paper with their paper. So they're basically looking at 10Ks, annual reports of firms, and whether they are mentioning biodiversity-related terms, and then they're aggregating this up. Now, so this is not an impact measure, right? You can imagine. It just measures whether people talk about biodiversity in a very sympathetic to that concept, you may know my work on climate change exposure, where we do this in earnings conference calls. Now, the issue is, however, that a lot of companies just don't have this yet on the radar. It's changing. It's going to change a lot for sure. Yeah, and so therefore, what you see here is we have a scatter plot in red, right? The CBF values of firms where biodiversity is mentioned in the 10Ks, and in green for those that where there's no mentioning of this. And you see they heavily overlap these two distributions, CBF distribution, which means that, yes, some firms with a large CBF talk about in their 10Ks biodiversity topics, but also many, many firms don't talk about it despite them having a very large CBF. One development, we have a similar figure, by the way, that we've seen recently is that similar to Climate Action 100 Plus, we have what's called Nature Action 100. So an investor coalition that starts engaging companies on nature topics. And so in the paper, we also have a distribution for, looking at the numbers for, Nature Action 100 targets. And also there you see, yes, some of the firms on the target list that will start getting engaged. Right? I mean, some, as you would expect, the firms that are on the list have a, large CPF, but there are also lots of firms not on the list that also still have a large CPF. So then the big question, of course, is, do investors care about it? And, from what I just said, you may say, yes, well, at least, investors have started to put a list of 100 firms out there where they think, biodiversity risk is a serious risk, and they start engaging them. But it's an empirical question eventually, and that's what we do. So what we do is we combine cross-sectionalized pricing tests with event study evidence. And the key events we look at are, the Kunming Declaration that I mentioned earlier, and also the TCFD launch. So the basic idea is important policy events should act as a catalyst that leads to revised investor expectations, to uncertainty, and the emergence of a risk premium for those firms that have large biodiversity transitions. Now, I should say risk premium with lots of quotation marks, because you can imagine what I do here is, and I'll explain in a second, is we're trying to estimate a risk premium using a couple of years of data. So if you're an asset pricer, you may say, how the heck, can they claim it's a risk premium, right? They haven't looked at 100 years of data, and that's what you need to establish a risk premium. That's right, but what we're doing here is still, I think, insightful, and in the paper I'll explain in a moment, we have some additional results that are also corroborating that it is likely to be a risk premium. So what we're doing is we're taking monthly stock returns and relate them to the CBF value and the set of controls. So this approach is very similar to what you have seen maybe by Marcin Kacperczyk and Patrick Bolton, that also estimate a risk premium, but for carbon emissions, the carbon risk premiums, climate transition risk. So they basically have the same setting and the same kinds of regression. So we follow them closely. And yeah, also those, papers don't have 100 years of data, but it's still insightful to get an idea of, where the carbon emissions, the carbon footprint here, biodiversity footprint is priced. So here are the results. If we look at the entire, sample period of the paper, we do not find that firms with a higher CBF value have to deliver higher returns, high expected returns to investors, expected returns that we proxy using realized returns. But we do find such an effect since the Kunming Declaration in October 2020. So if you look at the month after Kunming, we do find that a 1 standard deviation higher log CBF value implies 2.4% higher annual returns. And by the way, that holds when controlling for carbon emissions. And that's important because, as you've seen, one component of the CBF is carbon emissions. You want to make sure we're not just picking up a carbon risk premium. Now, Lasse Peterson has a new paper that shows that a lot of these risk premia in the ESG literature are kind of problematic, not very robust, and he recommends looking at implied cost of capital as a better proxy for expected returns. And we also do this in the paper and find results that are consistent with it. So if you don't believe that realized returns are a good proxy for expected returns, we also have this. And a final comment, you may say, well, maybe this is just reflecting that firms with a large CBF value are more profitable, have unexpectedly higher returns. also then we evaluate in the paper, and it's not the case. We don't find a link between the CBF value and, for example, earnings surprise and other things. So it is a risk premium and not a mispricing channel. So then we look at different returns, different event studies, and I'm about to conclude in a moment, so you can ask questions. So what we do is we're not just looking at these cross-sectional return regressions, but we're also looking at where this risk premium is coming from. So if you think about it, if you find that stocks with a more negative impact on biodiversity have to deliver higher expected returns to investors to compensate them for these climate transition risks, that at some point there's going to be a tax on the biodiversity impact of firms or other regulation, right? Then you should expect that in equilibrium at some point also the prices of these stocks need to go down. So because lower valuations mean higher expected returns. And now, of course, it's hard to pinpoint at which events exactly all these valuations go down so that we have the high expected returns. But we find them for two important adjustments of the valuation for two important events. So these are here now event study stock returns. And what you see here is that there was a decline in stock returns in market valuations of high CBF firms relative to low CBF firms around the Kunming Declaration. And we find something similar when the task force on nature-related financial disclosures were released. So in a sense, it kind of squares with the regressions earlier, but not just is there a higher return, but we can also identify some events where valuations declined, leading to higher expected returns for the large CBF funds. So what are the key takeaways? I think one important part of the paper is introducing a new measure of the CBF. And you see it's complicated. It's more complicated than just looking carbon emissions, the measure we use when looking at climate transition risks, because biodiversity is much more complex. And so it was a steep learning curve, and we still have a lot to learn for us because we had to understand what MSA is and CBF is and Globio and all that stuff. Second, then we study whether there is a risk premium, and we find a risk premium has started to emerge recently, with investors asking for higher compensation for higher returns when investing in firms that negatively impact biodiversity and in turn have high biodiversity transition risk. And so that's important because one implication of the paper is that no regulator, no investor, no company can anymore ignore biodiversity, at least if that constitutes a financially material risk given the CBF a firm has. And so therefore, it's important for all of these parties to think carefully whether they have taken the right steps to address this now financial market reality. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward in the remaining 10 minutes to your questions.
Zacharias, this is a very interesting presentation. For the audience, if you want to ask your question, please use the Q&A function. So while we wait for questions, I have one question to ask, and we touched upon a bit before the webinar. And this is, I personally have a hard time understanding the how biodiversity transition risk and climate transition risk are correlated. I think your basic assumption is that they're positively correlated, which would make sense. But the paper you mentioned by Giglio and co-authors, I know they're using different measures. They are finding that the correlation is negative. And they actually using some interesting examples. And one, for example, is that renewable energy producers do damage to biodiversity. So as you said in one of your slides, regulation is coming. If these companies, renewable energy companies, become regulated to protect biodiversity, that would limit their sort of operation. Or, for example, windmills, unintentionally, they kill migratory birds. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this.
Yeah. No, so I think this is an important debate. So I have multiple thoughts on it. So it's absolutely true. It can be the case that efforts to fight climate change lead to biodiversity loss. And the one example you gave is if you take the mountains behind me and you put there wind parks. Of course, you have to cut trees and you're gonna kill birds and things like this. So the micro level, that definitely can have a negative impact on biodiversity. Likewise, if you need all kinds of special materials, minerals to produce an electric battery, which you want to have in the car because we need to move away from the combustion engine to the electric engine. The mining of these things, of course, you can imagine, how a mine looks like, are bad for biodiversity. So that's right. So we need to be aware of these trade-offs. But that's not what we find. And, I don't know exactly why they find this negative relationship. Maybe it has to do with how they measure biodiversity, but not based on these 10Ks. And, maybe firms are making choices on, what to disclose on, and therefore introduce it. But in our paper, it's definitely, such that the biodiversity impact of companies on average positively correlates with the carbon emissions that firms have, right? And so this is an average statement. So that's not to say that there are some cases where it can be negative. But there's a second point that comes out of what you just said, and that's a debate we also have to have. So some people say we've been overwhelming companies, investors, the public, with all kinds of regulatory initiatives to fight climate change. And we need to pause and make sure that these things are carefully implemented and that we're harvesting the yields that we're hoping for and don't get disappointed. And because it's such a lot of measures that firms have to take, we should not now start imposing another dimension, biodiversity. So some people say we should prioritize and forget about everything but climate, right? Maybe you remember once the economist said ESG, we should just do E and replace environmental with emissions, and that's the thing we care about, and everything else is second order. Right? So some people say that's what we should do. Okay. Now I think it's a very, very risky strategy, and so I don't think it's gonna come. But I think we should have the discussion. It's important, and I think the good news is, as I mentioned earlier, we have lots of lessons learned from the climate discussion. So hopefully we don't do certain mistakes here that we have done on the climate side, and hopefully we can also move much faster, right? And so I don't think it's either or. These things are very clearly kind of related, as you have seen, right? I mean, one important driver of biodiversity loss is carbon emissions. Not to say there might maybe these trade-offs, right? So that's why I think it's an important discussion to have. But yes, even so, there are examples where these things are negatively correlated in kind of specific situations. Overall, carbon emissions are also bad for biodiversity.
So there are a couple of questions. One is, are there any regulations that have been issued for biodiversity globally or in any specific country that you might know of?
Right. I mean, there's a lot happening at the moment, right? And most of it also, is based on, commitments the companies have to, protect certain spatial areas, land, maritime ecosystems. And so it means regulating these, areas so that you can't build there anymore, can't cut trees anymore, and things like this. So that's definitely something that we are seeing. I don't think yet we are discussing about the equivalent of a carbon tax, right? So it's different. We have a different focus here. But it's certainly just a question of time until we have mandatory regulation on biodiversity issues. Until when firms have to engage also their supply chain over biodiversity, have to disclose about this, right? So there's a lot in the making, but it's nothing globally. So we're facing the same problem as on the climate side, that we don't have really global regulation.
Question, is it possible to estimate the size of the expected coming regulation given the size of your estimates? Is there a difference between European firms and US firms, particularly given the EU nature restoration law, etc.?
So this is one specific law that you rightly mentioned. And I think here, similar to the climate side, we are seeing that Europe is moving ahead. And I think probably also knowing that they're not making the difference eventually, because like, you know, we don't have global numbers, but on the climate side, I mean, Europe is responsible for 7% of global industrial emissions. And, you know, if we would have a global biodiversity impact measure, probably, you know, it would be similar for Europe on biodiversity, on the biodiversity side. But nevertheless, Europe has understood that they have to set the standards and give them, you know, a guidance that the world has to follow. So I think it's clearly much more than what we have in the US, and we'll have also in the US with the likely, you know, election outcome that we're seeing, right? But also there, you know, it's a question of time. You know, or I should say also there in the US, you know, there is a latent risk also with Trump. I mean, just imagine, you know, the following scenario, right? I think we agree, you know, Trump only starts to get, you know, his act together if he's personally affected, right? Now, suppose Mar-a-Lago gets flooded, you know, because of a storm, because of, you know, a hurricane, whatever, and he personally realizes how climate change affects him. Right? I think it's a totally realistic scenario, you know, not 90% probably, but also not zero, right? That then he's changing his mind if he gets elected and says, well, you know, I realize climate change matters and we have to do something. And something similar may happen on the biodiversity side, right? So also there for the US, I think there is a very serious transition risk, and it's the uncertainty about all of these things happening that is starting to get priced, and where also, you know, US firms may be impacted. Right? So yes, you know, we are doing much more in Europe, but that's not to say that the transition risks are you know, just in Europe. They may also be actually in the US.
The end of our webinar. Zacharias, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and thank you the audience for attending our webinar today. Our next webinar will be will take place on September 9th, and our speaker will be Catherine Wolfram, who will discuss possible policies, climate policies in the US after the expiration of the IRA. Oh, I think there is maybe one. No. Okay. So thank you very much. It was a great presentation. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for, you know, spending your time with me. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.